This is Loki, one of the original 8 Warframes and in desperate need of a rework. Or at least that's what most players think. But here's the thing. I believe that just a small little fix would already go a long way to make him much more viable. So, in today's Warframe guide, we're of course gonna take an in-depth look at Loki, his skills, how to build him, and I also want to share some thoughts on how I personally would fix him. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, well, let's jump right into it. Now, as always, let's first start talking about what Loki can actually do, starting out with his passive, and this one is very straightforward. You extend your wall latch duration. That's it. To be fair, compared to other passive abilities in the game, this would end up relatively low on the tier list, but hey, I'm sure there are certain niche circumstances where this would come in handy. In fact, with this passive, you can latch onto a wall for a whole minute without falling down. However, let's rather talk about his active skills now, and usually I would go over them chronologically, but for Loki, his first ability Decoy, that's actually something I want to talk about right at the end, so how about we start out with his second ability, Switch Teleport. This one, at base, is a relatively simple ability. You can aim it at allies as well as enemies, and what it does is you simply swap positions with them. After the position swap, you also increase your movement speed for a while. You can see a little movement speed comparison on screen here. Now, to be fair, Switch Teleport is not a completely useless skill, right? There are situations where it comes in handy. For example, in these Cetus bounties where you need to escort the drone, what you can do is you can actually run ahead of the drone and then Switch Teleport with it to sort of speed up the whole process. But if we're totally honest, then I think we can all agree that this is a very niche ability that you don't need all too often. However, there is an augment called Safeguard Switch, and this switches up the thing quite a bit. What this one does is, basically it's rolling guard, just much better. After you switch positions, you will become completely invincible for 3 seconds. However, those 3 seconds scale with ability duration, therefore you can extend this duration quite a bit, which is very nice and much stronger than rolling guard. But what's more is, you can also refresh the timer by doing this again and again all the time, and just like rolling guard, it also clears your negative status effects. But what's even better is, if you switch positions with an ally, then that ally also becomes invincible, but even twice as long as you. Overall, I think this is a great survivability tool, and I would rather use this than rolling guard on him. Ability number 3 goes by the name Invisibility, and that is exactly what it does. You make yourself invisible. That's it. Timer runs out, you're not invisible anymore. Unfortunately, you can't recast it while you are still invisible, so that's a bit of a nuisance. And there's also an augment called Hushed Invisibility, which makes it that your weapons become silent while you are invisible. If you need that, you can of course go for it, but I think, aren't there excellence mods for all the weapons out there which also make them silent? Not 100% sure, but I would say Hushed Invisibility is niche at best. Ability number 4 is called Radial Disarm, and this one is a very good crowd control ability. What it does is actually very simple. Enemies in an AoE around you will be disarmed, dropping their guns, forcing them into melee, and this has no duration, so this is basically infinite. But that's not all, there's also an augment called Irradiating Disarm, and what this does is, on top of dropping their guns, it also confuses the enemies into attacking each other. On the mod, it says that it inflicts radiation, but in reality, it doesn't inflict radiation, it just inflicts the confusion status effects itself, so it unfortunately doesn't count in the condition overload. But especially in stationary defense type missions, if you want to disable all the enemies around you very quickly, this is going to be the ability for you. But now that we talked about his second, third, and fourth ability, let's finally talk about his first, which I postponed until now, and this one goes by the name Decoy. See, at base, Decoy is actually really darn simple. You throw out a decoy and that distracts the enemies, so they focus on the decoy. Now, there is a funny interaction with the enemy AI in Warframe where if you position a decoy in very specific locations, it can kind of end up disabling the entire enemy AI, which is really funny. Nova Umbral and Nev have made a video explaining this in detail. I'm gonna put you the link in the cards in case you want to check it out later. However, one thing that I think is very important to understand here is that even though the decoy distracts the enemies, it doesn't make them completely oblivious of what's going on around them. As you can also see in the background right here, if the decoy is on the field, of course, the enemy is going to attack the decoy, but as soon as I get closer to the enemy is going to start noticing that I am the bigger threat and therefore switches targets away from the decoy towards me. If I then move further away again, the enemy is going to switch back to the decoy, so you gotta be aware that if the decoy is on the field, it will be a distraction, but only as long as there is no valid target closer to the enemy that the enemy perceives to be a higher threat. Now, for completion's sake, I do want to mention that there exist these two augments for Decoy right here, but I think in most cases Loki shouldn't need them because he not only has invisibility but also this invincibility teleport augment. Therefore, I personally wouldn't necessarily recommend going for them. What is much more interesting though is the second augment for Decoy. That goes by the name Damage Decoy, and that is also the reason why I wanted to talk about Decoy at the very end, because I have a little bit of a rant incoming here. First of all, what Damage Decoy does on paper is actually very well thought out, and the idea of it is amazing. Instead of throwing a Loki decoy out that basically doesn't do anything, you can now cast Decoy at an enemy, turning that enemy into the decoy, making other enemies attack that decoy enemy. Anytime another enemy hits the decoy enemy, that other enemy is going to take 5 random status effects, and the entire damage that they dealt to the decoy enemy will be redirected towards them. So you basically make the enemies hurt themselves. In theory, this is really amazing because it has crazy status priming potential, and with enough ability strength, it also deals quite some damage with the damage redirection. But Damage Decoy has one big major problem, and this is also why I put out this meme the other day here. So let me take a minute to explain to you what exactly I'm up to here. Since Damage Decoy spreads random status effects, that means if the entire room starts shooting at the decoy enemy, it's only natural that some of those enemies will also become inflicted with radiation. However, as we previously pointed out, enemies only focus on the decoy as long as there is no other valid target close by. And unfortunately, irradiated enemies are being perceived as a threat, so if there is an irradiated enemy closer than the decoy, then enemies will start focusing on the irradiated enemies rather than the decoy. Therefore, the entire status priming and the entire redirection of damage is gonna come to a grinding halt. This makes me incredibly sad because it means that the very feature of the augment, that being the damage and the status spread, is sabotaging the augment itself. In fact, I would go so far to say that if Damage Decoy would not have this problem and the whole damage and status spread would be more consistent, then Loki would be much higher in the current meta than he ends up being. But let's talk about this and how I would personally fix it later in the video. And as always, if you could maybe leave a like for the video, that would be amazing because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But okay, rant over, let's now talk about the builds, and here I have 2 prepared for you today. One being an invincible weapons platform build, and the other one uses a very funny interaction that allows Loki to nuke entire rooms full of steel path enemies. However, let's start with the weapons platform first. How this one works is actually really darn simple. You use your invisibility to stay invisible, because if you're invisible, you're not going to be attacked, and that is very good for survivability. If, for whatever reason, you do take a hit and your shield breaks, no problem, we're going to use the augment for Switch Teleport. That will give us a lot of iframes, so the combination of both skills should make it very, very easy for you to stay alive constantly. And then we're also going to use the Damage Decoy augment because while yes, it is flawed, it is still pretty decent at spreading status effects, so that's what we're doing here. If you wanted to, you could use a Helminth ability and use it instead of his 4th, but especially if you're playing stationary defense type missions, I think his 4 is actually not all too bad, and that is why for this build, I personally did not replace it. Now, let's take a look at the Archon shards, where What I did here is very straightforward. I invested everything into duration for maximum convenience, so we don't have to recast our stuff that often. But if you wanted to, you could do a whole lot of other stuff, maybe yellow shards for casting speed, or also green shards for more corrosive application and armor stripping. Really, the choice here is yours. Now, for the build itself, what I did is go all out into duration, because funnily, none of Loki's base abilities really need ability strength, so that is kind of a complete dump stat. However, if you were to use a helmet ability in his 4th that does require strength, then you will have to mix the whole thing up a little bit, of course, but as it stands right now, this is how it looks like. In the aura, use whatever you like. The choice here is yours. Same thing for the Excella slot. Here, I personally went for preparation, just for maximum convenience, but you can always replace it with pretty much anything else. And then, of course, I massively doubled down into duration with narrow-minded, augur message, mold efficiency, and prime continuity. Just 2 things I want to mention here. Instead of augur message, you could use constitution that has a few % more duration, but unfortunately this didn't fit on the build, just wanted to point that out. And instead of prime continuity, you can also always use archon continuity, because with the damage decoy, we're going to deal a whole lot of toxin, so we also get free corrosive this way. Next, because narrow-minded takes away a whole lot of range, I went for overextended to compensate for that. Again, we don't really need strength if we don't use a helmet ability, so overextended doesn't hurt. Prime Flow and Archon Stretch for the energy economy, and then, as I just said, Safeguard Switch and Damage Decoy will be the 2 augments that we use here. As for the second Arcane slot, since this is a weapons platform build, of course we're gonna go with Arcane Crepuscular, massively increasing our crit damage bonus, and since we're gonna be constantly invisible, this will constantly be on too. That then here would be the full build. It's definitely not the strongest Gunrunner build in terms of damage output. Cyto 9, Saren, Harrow, they're basically all better, but if you are in a stationary defense scenario, I think this Loki build might be an option too, because of the 4th ability that disarms the enemy. As for your companion, weapon, or helmet options, you are actually completely free to go for what absolutely ever you like. I don't even want to make any recommendations here, because this is such a basic foundation type of build that you can nudge it into whichever direction you personally please. So in case you want to, feel free to also let us know in the comments down below what you would personally choose here. Now, so much for the Gunrunner build. Let's now talk about the NUKE build, and that's actually a very fun interaction. However, I should mention that I didn't come up with that myself. I actually saw it in a video by a creator called Jailmate. I don't know if they originally came up with it, it's just the source that I personally saw it first. Also, link in the cards. If you end up liking this build, definitely check out the video because there is a lot of explanation going on there. But to put it in very simple terms, what happens here is the following. As a helmet ability, we use Marked for Death. What this does is, it marks an enemy, and then the next hit that they take, the health that they lose from this hit, is going to be dealt to all the enemies around them, scaling with ability strength. Now, by definition, if you cast this on an enemy with a lot of health, that means a lot of damage will be redirected outwards, but if you put it on a foe with low health, then because they don't lose as much health then, that also means that the damage spread is a problem. Now, the reason that this is nice on Loki is, again, the damage decoy augment, because what this does is, when you cast it on an enemy, this enemy will get their maximum HP increased based on how many enemies are standing around them. You can also see it right here on the ability card. That makes it that when you use Marked for Death on the damage decoy enemy, they will have so much health that when you take them out, the damage should be high enough so that you can instantly nuke everyone in the room. Again, if you want to have a more in-detail explanation, check out the original video in the info card later. For the Archon shards here, ideally to get the most damage possible, you want to have a lot of ability strength. This right here would be the build that I personally chose, going into ability strength and also a lot of range so that the AoE is bigger. And one specific interaction that I want to talk about here would be Arcane Impetus, because this is actually super duper awesome on this build. Through damage decoy, you're gonna deal so many different status effects that Arcane Impetus will basically be at a constant max stack, giving you not only a ton of ability strength, but also ability efficiency, which comes in very nicely with this build because it is relatively ability spammy, and this way you're not gonna run out of energy. One more thing I should mention is, I replaced his third ability with Marked for Death because I wanted to have my 4 sort of as a panic button to disarm the enemies if that is ever needed. But what you can also always do is replace his 4 with Marked for Death. This way then you would replace Umbral Intensify with Precision Intensify, making Marked for Death even stronger. And you could also drop Rolling Guard for Safeguard Switch, which I think is the better option if you don't want to use his 4. Alright, these builds are of course not terrible, but we gotta be real here, they're also not amazing compared to what other Warframes can pull off. So now, let me share some thoughts on how I personally think Loki could be made much more viable in an actually relatively easy and straightforward way. See, the first thing that we need to talk about here is Loki's invisibility. If we for 1 second take a look at all the other stealth Warframes, Ivara, Octavia, Ashe, Cyto 9, and so on and so forth, then, especially after the upcoming Ashe rework, Loki, the OG stealth Warframe, will be the one Warframe out of all stealth Warframes that ends up being the worst at stealth. And I think that should not be the case. So, in my opinion, the first thing that he needs is some sort of mechanic, like other Warframes, with which he can extend his own stealth duration. Either you could integrate that right into his invisibility skill right away, or if you really wanted to, make it part of one of his augments or something. But given the fact that he already is so augment reliant, I'd rather have it in his invisibility skill right away. But where his invisibility uptime is more of a nuisance and not really a problem since you can just always instantly recast it, the one thing that I personally have a real problem with is damage decoy, as I also previously explained, and that, if you ask me, needs to be changed, and here is exactly how I would do that. As we previously pointed out, the biggest issue with damage decoy is that it spreads radiation and therefore it turns the enemies against each other, distracting them from the decoy so that the damage spread in the status application cannot really work anymore. So, how do we fix that? Actually, it's relatively simple. There are 2 options. Option 1 would be kind of the brute force way, just saying, well, it now spreads all possible elements except radiation, and then the problem is solved. Or, and I think this would be the more elegant solution, make it so that the decoy has a little bit of a higher enemy aggro than irradiated enemies. This way, when radiation spreads in the room, enemies will no longer turn on each other, at least not as much anymore, but still keep the majority of their focus on the decoy. Just to be clear here, the enemies should still be able to kind of return fire if you as the player shoot at them. Just make it so that they don't get distracted by other enemies anymore. I think at the end of the day, if the enemies were to be able to continuously focus on the decoy more, then the status application from this augment would be so crazy that it elevates Loki in the meta quite a bit, and especially if you mod into enough strength, then even at lower levels, the damage redirection should be enough to get a decent amount of kills. But what is your opinion on damage decoy? Let us know in the comments down below. And speaking of buffing Warframes, the next update will be a huge power increase for so many Warframes. And if you want to know all about that, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Ondakanio2, Pepperwolf, Miyaki, Hoke Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot and have a great start into the weekend.